Alrighty-roo, here we go again. This chapter follows directly after Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, specifically Judah, for 20 pieces of silver. Kind of cheap. But this is not going to get into Joseph. That is the next chapter. This one is Judah and Tamar. Luckily, I just listened to a study that had a lot to do with this, so I have a lot of background information. Because otherwise, I would not look into this. This is just one of those throwaway stories, in my opinion, in the Bible. Not that there should be. You shouldn't be. That's why we're doing every chapter. But we all have that mentality. Like, I don't know about you, but I used to always skip over the generations because I did not care at all. It's like, whatever. This is boring. Get to the cooler, funner, more fun, interesting parts of the Bible. Tell me about David's mighty men and things like that. And this is kind of one of those, especially as a kid, especially if you read the King James Version, you're like, what? I don't even really understand what's going on here. So Judah and Tamar. Tamar is his eldest son's promised wife. And you'll see what happens in here, and we'll talk about it. I'm going to read the New International, not the King James, just because the language makes it a lot more clear, and you're not really missing much in the translation. But just remember that this is a kind of weird story. All right. So New International. About this, Genesis 38. About this time, Judah left home and moved to Adullam, where he stayed with a man named Hirah. There he saw a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua, and he married her. When he slept with her, she became and bare a son, and he called his name And she conceived again and bare a son, and she called his name Onan. And she yet again conceived and bare a son, and called his name Shelah. And he was Chezib when she bare him. Sorry, I went to King James there for a little instead. But so now he has 3 sons by this Canaanite woman that he married when he moved. He got old enough, he moved out of the household. He's probably kind of ashamed. I mean, think about it. His dad is weeping for a long time. He's probably totally changed as a man. I'm sure it's just kind of less pleasant to be around after he thinks his son Joseph, his favorite son, has been killed by a beast of the land. And Judah knows that it's not true. I'm sure it's weighing on his conscience heavily that, no, your son's alive, I sold him into slavery. And he's scared. He obviously doesn't want to tell his dad the truth, but he still feels burden, upon his heart. So I'm sure he wanted to get out of there. He just wanted to get out of the situation. So he leaves, and he ends up marrying a Canaanite woman. Now, for whatever reason, I've talked about it extensively in all these past videos of mine. If you want to get into the bloodline thing, if you want to get into whatever it may be, marrying the Canaanite line is not okay with the Hebrews. I have made it clear that though I do believe in the Watchers coming down in Genesis 6 and mixing the bloodlines of fallen angels with human beings, I don't think the Bible contradicts itself, and I think it states that very clearly in the Bible. But I believe they were wiped out after the flood. Now, then Ham's line through Canaan is cursed, and these are the Canaanites. You may say that through some form they changed their DNA through dark magic or whatever. I mean, I've heard all this stuff. And whatever, I don't care. Like, maybe they are different bloodline, maybe they aren't. It's interesting to think of and to talk about. And we do see giants coming from these lines, so who knows? Maybe they're doing human GMOs or something. I mean, that we do know the ancient technology. The more and more we learn about it, there's tons of stuff they could do that we didn't think they could, that we can't do now. But all that being said, I tend to think that the reason the Canaanites were not ones that you marry is because of their culture. I've said this many times. It's the culture. Not that there's anything wrong with, interracial marriages or anything like that at all. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is cultures. Be aware of like a Mexican woman or man and an Irish woman and man, they probably get married pretty well. As far as virtues and morals go, they're pretty similar. As far as, the side things of culture that I like to call them, like what you like to do for entertainment, what do you like to do for fun, how these sort of things, that's different. But, family, God, working hard, these are the virtues that they have. So that's what it's great. But if you take someone who has a totally different set of values and virtues than you, I mean totally different, the core of them are totally different. The Canaanites worshiped this pantheon of gods that believed in just the worst type of worship. And I don't want to keep getting into it, but I will, because each video is new and this may be your first one. So it's like blood sacrifices and weird orgies and things with animals and just the worst type of stuff. So disease is rampant, and this is seen as virtuous. This is seen as a good thing by these other cultures, specifically the Canaanite line. This is how you should live. Do what thou wilt. That's their mentality. Do what makes you feel good, you know? And since the role of women in this time is to raise children, that's their role. The man takes care of the current generation and the people currently. The women prepare the next generation. They educate them, they teach them and how to be good adults. And this is seen in Proverbs. We know that this is the role of women of this time, is to prepare the next generation. So if a woman who believes in a totally different set of virtues and values and religious beliefs than you raises your children and your next generation, what do you think that they're going to believe? And this is why it was so dire whenever the sons married these Canaanite women. And they did it so much because their culture is like, yeah, sex all the time, do what thou will, you know, lust, and is serve thyself, you know. That's what they're offering to you. Most people are like, yeah, awesome. I didn't know it was seen as virtuous as a good thing to do whatever I wanted. I thought I'd have like discipline, you know. So it's like easy, it's eager. They're gonna jump on board this, you know, gravy train of doing whatever you want whenever they can. So that's what's going on. And Judah, when he leaves, more than likely, the Bible doesn't say this, is my speculation, but more than likely due to guilt because of what he did to Joseph and his father being so mournful about it. He leaves out of guilt, marries this Canaanite woman, and has 3 sons with her. And again, it's the culture. This woman is raising your children to believe in totally different values than you were raised to believe in. This is why it's seen as a problem. Because think about it. Jacob wants his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, everyone, to continue with his beliefs. Just like anybody, that you want your grandchildren to stay close to God or your idea of God. This is just a cultural thing no matter where you're at in the history of the world. And if you know that this woman who doesn't believe in your stuff is going to be raising your kids to think that your way is wrong and their way is right, it's going to bother you. And that's why Jacob, we'll see, gets very bothered by it. Anyway, verse 6. In the course of time, Judah arranged for his firstborn son to marry a young woman named Tamar. But was a wicked man in the Lord's sight, so the Lord took his life. Let's see what the King James says about that. And verse 7, and Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. All right, same thing. Then Judah said to Er's brother Onan, go and marry Tamar, as our law requires of the brother of a man who has died. You must produce an heir for your brother. But Onan was not willing to have a child who would not be his own heir. So whenever he had intercourse with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen on the ground. This prevented her from having a child who would belong to his brother. But the Lord considered it evil for Onan to deny a child to his dead brother, so the Lord took Onan's life too. Even though God thought was wicked and slew him, he still slays Onan because Onan won't give his seed to this woman to be the heir of his older brother. You know, he's like, I want my own heir, and this kid's going to be known as the heir of the. It's weird how it works, but that's just the legal law of the time of Jacob's line. Judah is following Jacob's legal law. You know, go marry her. You have to provide an heir for him, and this will be his heir. I don't understand the difference because Er's gone, so wouldn't Onan get Er's inheritance anyway because he's the next oldest? But I don't understand all the legalities of this stuff at the time, but it's just, you know, the way that society at the time saw it. They wouldn't see it as Onan's son, so he spills his seed. And even though God thought the older one, was evil, he still says that because you denied a son, you're evil as well. Now, this goes back to what I said. The Canaanite woman that Judah married is raising her children. She's teaching them Canaanite ways. She's teaching them, do what thou wilt, serve thyself. The God of your father is not real, or he's not the most powerful God, even if he is. They believe he's real, I'm sorry, but they don't think that he's the God to worship. Their gods are the ones to worship. So that they're seen as wicked. Like, he's probably doing all these terrible things in the name of the Canaanite gods, and gods, like, not only you worship other gods, but the way that they ask for you to worship them is completely evil. Onan, who knows, maybe he did a better job than but the fact that he was unwilling to, I think he was probably just as bad. I mean, these three children are raised by a mother who's telling them wicked things, basically. So none of them end up being good. And now 2 of them are dead. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, go back into your parents' home and remain a widow until my son Shelah is old enough to marry. But Judah didn't really intend to do this because he was afraid Shelah would also die like his 2 brothers. So Tamar went back to live in her father's home. Gotta go over here real quick. You know what I'm saying? Verse 11. Then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow till Shea my son groweth. For he said, lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know about this whole part where he never intended to do it, because the King James doesn't really make it clear that he didn't intend to do it. But in either case, it doesn't really change the story here. So he's like, go back to your dad's household when the 3rd eldest is old enough, he'll marry you. This is an arranged marriage thing. Verse 12. Some years later, Judah's wife died. After the time of mourning was over, Judah and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went up to Timnah to supervise the shearing of his sheep. Someone told Tamar, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. Tamar was aware that Shelah had grown up, but no arrangement had been made for her to come and marry him. So she changed out of her widow's clothing and covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. Then she sat beside the road at the entrance to the village of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. Judah noticed her and thought she was a prostitute, or a harlot, as the King James says. I like the word harlot more, since she had covered her face. So he stopped and propositioned her. Let me have sex with you, he said, not realizing that she was his own daughter-in-law. How much will you pay to have sex with me? Tamar said. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, Judah promised. But what will you give me to guarantee that you will send the goat? She asked. What kind of guarantee do you want? He replied. She answered, leave me your identification seal and its cord, and the walking stick you are carrying. So Judah gave them to her. Then he had intercourse with her, and she became pregnant. Afterward, she went back home, took off her veil, and put on her widow's clothing as usual. All right. I don't really need to stop. I'm going to, because that's quite a bit of reading. Basically, 2 sons die with this woman before a child can come. The 3rd son, when he gets old enough, he's supposed to marry her. Years go by. He's on his way to go shear watch some sheep being sheared. And, I mean, they didn't have TV, so it's probably a highlight for them. And on the way, or his supposed to be daughter-in-law, his widowed daughter-in-law, is told that he's going to be coming. So she wants, because she's like, why haven't I married Shelah? He's old enough now. Nothing's been arranged. I haven't heard word to come. So I'm going to go. I mean, these aren't necessarily righteous people. Remember that. These are just stories. And she's not necessarily doing it the right way. This isn't like an example of how to live. Remember that. Like, she should have just confronted him up front, But instead, like, it's just crazy to me, like, what goes through their head. It's like watching a sitcom and the crazy ideas that people come up with to get out of, like, their wife finding out about something. So her idea, instead of just, oh, great, he's coming. I haven't seen him in a while. I'll go talk to him. Why wouldn't I? In fact, it probably would have worked much better if she'd done that, because he was in public and he wouldn't want to shame himself in public. So if she called him out in public, he would have had to, like, oh, you're right, okay. But no, not in her clever mind. no, no, no. Old Tamar decides she's going to dress up like a harlot and seduce him. But she's the way she is clever, shrewd, whatever you want to call it, because she asks for his identification. Remember, the identification. Things that are personally his that people will know are his, because that comes into play. So she's kind of clever in what she does here. It would have been better to just come up front with it. So now she's pregnant. He pays her for sex he says, I'm going to give you a young goat of my flock, but before I give it to you, to guarantee it, here's my seal of identification stuff so you can call me out, if I owe you money. And she takes it, has sex with him, gets pregnant, goes back home, and puts back on her widow's clothing. Later, this is verse 20, later Judah asked his friend Hurrah, the Adullamite, to take the young goat to the woman and pick up the things he had given her as his guarantee. But Hurrah couldn't find her, so he asked the men who lived there, where can I find the shrine prostitute who was sitting beside the road at the entrance of a name? We've never had a shrine prostitute here, they replied. So Hira returned to Judah and told him, I couldn't find her anywhere, and the men of the village claim they've never had a shrine prostitute there. Then let her keep the things I gave her, Judah said. I sent the goat as we agreed, but you couldn't find her. We'd be the laughing stock of the village if we went back again to look for her. So, alright, I need my stuff back. Hiram, go give this stuff to that whore that I hired. So, he goes, we don't have a prostitute in town. What are you talking about? We don't have one of those. Okay. Goes back, tells Judah, and Judah's like, whatever, let her keep the stuff. We can't keep looking for her. That's embarrassing, to look for the prostitute that I hired over and over again. It's just an embarrassing situation. So whatever. She can keep that stuff, and I'll keep the goat. I held up my end of the bargain. Alright, verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has acted like a prostitute, and now, because of this, she's pregnant. Bring her out and let her be burned, Judah demanded. But as they were taking her out to kill her, she sent this message to her father-in-law. The man who owns these things made me pregnant. Look closely whose seal and cord and walking stick are these. So again, this wasn't the right way to handle things, Tamar, but it was quite clever. I will give you that much. And this reminds me a lot of the story with David and the prophet Nathaniel, and how Nathaniel calls him out for David's great sin of having his general go to the front line so he'd die, and then he could marry that woman, the general's wife, or have the general's wife as his concubine or whatever. So, and Nathaniel gives like a parable to him, or like a story that is like a metaphor for exactly what's going on with David. And when David asks, who is this person that's done this wicked thing? Nathan's like, it's you. And David realizes that it's him. So that's what I'm talking about here is Judah finds out that his daughter-in-law has acted like a prostitute. The daughter-in-law basically that he'd written off, that he didn't have to worry about anymore, and wasn't taken care of, and wasn't planning on marrying her to his next son like he was supposed to and like he promised. So, but he finds out she's acting like a prostitute, and he immediately condemns her. Bring her and burn her. That's wrong. Knowing the whole time he's had sex with a prostitute. So, like, if you're so anti-prostitution, why were you a prostitute? Yeah, I know it's your widowed daughter-in-law, so it's embarrassing to you, but does it really change? She's always somebody's daughter or sister, That's why prostitution is frowned upon in your faith, in your culture. But you had sex with a prostitute, this exact prostitute, actually. And it takes him seeing that it was him that did it to realize how wicked it was, which to me is ridiculous. But I think this is true in most people's lives, and even in mine. I shouldn't say that I'm like better or anything, but what if you can see something that you've done from a third party point of view or a third person perspective, it's much easier to be like, oh, okay, oh, yikes, that is bad. So many people trick their own minds into thinking what they're doing is right because it feels right versus living by God's rules. And this is true of anyone. It is definitely true of Judah here. Actually, there's a few things. I think it's the book Think and Grow Rich where it talks about true, successful people learn from their mistakes. highly successful people learn from other people's mistakes, so they personally don't have to make them. And this is something to remember. If you can learn from other people's mistakes, it also comes with like the domains of cognitive learning, I think, or whatever, where it talks about once you're able to, at a certain age, you're finally able to think logically in abstract situations. You know, I think the third level of like development is where you can think logically in real time, real world situations right in front of you. But once you can think abstractly but also logically, that's the final stage that you're trying to get to. And a lot of adults don't get to it. Think about it. If Judah could think abstractly and learn from other people's mistakes, logically and abstractly, he would never have had sex with a prostitute. And he certainly wouldn't have immediately condemned his daughter-in-law to death for being a prostitute, knowing the whole time that he's guilty of the same sin. All right, verse 26. Judah recognized them immediately and said, "She is more righteous than I am, because I didn't arrange for her to marry my son Shelah." And Judah never slept with Tamar again. You know, and we see later on, we really do, Judah has a, as far as like, if you're thinking about writing a story and character arcs, Judah has one of the most amazing ones, really, because he comes full circle from being a jealous brother who sells his righteous brother into slavery, and he comes full circle, and you really see it, especially if you get into some of the, again, more verifiable non-canonicals, like the testimony of the 12 patriarchs. He realizes his woes, this really humbles him. You know, and again, when he comes back face to face with Joseph, again, it humbles him. And he comes full circle. And I really respect the story of Judah here, because he starts out as really like a jerk, you know, just not a good guy. And he ends up, he Jaime Lannisters it. He comes full circle, baby. And yeah, he realizes that she's more righteous than I am, because I didn't arrange. He saw that, he saw his flaws. Just like David when Nathaniel calls him out. He's then able to see his flaws. All right, verse 27. When the time came for Tamar to give birth, it was discovered that she was carrying twins. While she was in labor, one of the babies reached out his hand. The midwife grabbed it and tied a scarlet string around the child's wrist, announcing this one came out first. But then he pulled back his hand and came out his brother. "What?" the midwife exclaimed. "How did you break out first?" So he was named Perez. Let's see what that is. Perez means breaking out, brightness. Then the baby with the scarlet string on his wrist was born, and he was named Zerah, which means scarlet. Oh, that one means brightness, sorry. Perez is breaking out. That one means scarlet. All right. So basically, one thing to realize here is these three sons of Judah by this Canaanite woman basically get removed completely from the genealogy. So this Canaanite line is completely removed from the genealogy of Christ. Remember, Christ comes from Judah's line. So these three sons are completely removed. And we can go back. Sorry, I don't mean to be making this longer than it needs to be, but I just feel like some of this stuff is important. So verse Tamar. I want to find out exactly what it says about her lineage. And Judah took a wife, and Judah's firstborn was the wicked. Alright. Yeah, it doesn't really say anything about Tamar's lineage. Yeah, that's weird. It doesn't say much about Tamar's lineage. I should have looked into that a bit more, and maybe I'll mention it in my next video. But the three sons of the Canaanite women are wiped out of the line because they, again, I've talked about this earlier with the blessing. You can't get the blessing if you don't get the blessing. If you don't get that it's not about living for yourself, it's about living for God, then you can't receive it. And obviously, these three sons raised by this Canaanite woman, because that was the role of women at the time, was to teach the next generation how to be good adults. And then once you're an adult, you're taking care of the current generation. If you're a male, if you're a female, you're preparing the next generation. And say what you will about, patriarchy and all that. I'm just saying that's what it was at the time. That was the roles of each side. So these three sons are not following in God's ways whatsoever. And it's going to be much harder for God's ways to be continued to taught later on down the road. Again, so, because they're not going to want to marry a prude Hebrew type woman and have them raise their kids. No, no, no. So they had to be removed. And the next sons that Judah has, that continues his lineage, are with his actual daughter-in-law, who tricked him, and having two bastards, twins. It's just a weird story if you think about it. Again, I certainly think the more godly thing to have done here, if you're Tamar and the third-born son is supposed to marry you, you should have just gone and called out Judah directly. But this also goes to show that nothing falls outside God's providence. God wants us to live a godly life. But if we act ungodly, he'll still use it for good. He can make, lemonade out of lemons like no one's business, man. So even though Judah sleeps with this woman that he should not have slept with at all, he then has sons. And the sons carry on his lineage. I'm pretty sure these two sons carry on his lineage. I may be misquoting myself here. But in the end, he sees the righteousness or the unrighteousness of his ways. And again, Judah becomes one of those characters who comes full circle in the Bible. And we'll get far more into that. But the main thing to take away from this particular reading is learn to think logically in the abstract. Think about things ahead of time. Be able to see outside of your own self and learn from other people's mistakes. Okay, if you're just living right for the moment and you think you can get away with stuff like Judah, I can get away with not marrying my daughter-in-law to my next son like I'm supposed to. I can get away with, having sex with this prostitute. But in public, I'll condemn prostitutions, or people of my family participating in prostitution because that dishonors my family. But weren't you dishonoring it? And in the end, he sees this. So, like I said, it's kind of one of those chapters, and for the most part, I just skip over because genealogy stuff isn't that important to me, and I always saw this as a genealogy thing because the point I was taught about this is that basically it wipes out the Canaanite bloodline of Judah's line. That's the whole point. But again, and I'm going to do some more research, it doesn't really say anything right there about the line of Tamar. Like, where does she come from then? But anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed this. We're going to get into Joseph in the next few ones, and I think those are more interesting stories. But everything in the Bible has an important thing to it. If you can look into it, if you read it with an open mind and try to analyze it, the psychology of the people, what they're going through, why they're making the decisions, and realize that these people, especially, are not Christ. They're not perfect. They're making mistakes. And you can learn from the mistakes, and the way that they live isn't always the proper way to live. Now, God will still love you even if you don't live a completely proper life, if you stay righteous and follow Him. But at the same time, you will have a better life if you learn from their mistakes and trust in God and His teachings. All right, everyone, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, or good night.